This is Antonio Eduardo Dagnino, a man who met and lived among the biggest spiritual gurus of the last century. He used to meet with Jiddu Krishnamurti, he spent years living with Anandamayi Ma, with Sathya Sai Baba, he met with Osho, with Neem Karoli Baba, with Papaji, and so many others, even with some Western figures such as Ram Dass. And what Antonio was able to learn and experience with all these gurus is what makes his story extraordinary. He was able to experience all sorts of elevated states of consciousness with them, pure unity. He was shown past life regressions, direct visions of Krishna. He also witnessed all kinds of miracles. He even did the 5M Tantric ritual with the Agori and so much more. And here's what makes even all of these more remarkable is that Antonio comes from an intellectual background. A university professor who decided to travel to India, throw away all his Western clothes, live in the crematoriums, live with the locals, and do this whole thing the authentic, real way. But here's the thing. No one on YouTube has told Antonio's story yet. Even though in the realm of spirituality, I would say he's lived one of the most incredible and fascinating lives I've ever encountered. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Me and a friend reached out to Antonio a while back. He's 85 now, living in Venezuela, that's where he's from. And we started talking with him. At first, it was just some messages, then some calls. But over time, we were very lucky to get to develop a good personal relationship with Antonio. And nowadays, we talk almost every single week. We do multiple hour calls here and there, and we exchange really long voice messages. And at this point, he's told me almost his entire life story, the most significant events that happened to him, and the most important lessons that he learned. And that's why I'm making this video, so I can share all of it with you. It's a different video from what I usually make. This might be more of a documentary type of video, but I think it's gonna be cool. I've recorded all of the video calls I've made with Antonio. I will share some clips of the most interesting parts where Antonio himself will tell some of his stories. And then there's something very special that I'm gonna share with you, but I'm gonna save it for the end of the video. Because first, I want you to see and fully understand this incredible journey that Antonio's life has been. So everything began when Antonio was just a kid, because that's already when he had his first major spiritual experience. It happened when he was only 9 or 10 years old, and it's something that in a way it shows that everything that was about to unfold in Antonio's life was predestined. The fact that he was going to be with all these gurus and have all these experiences, what you're about to see is basically like the catalyst, the beginning. So to give you some context, Antonio grew up in an unusual environment. His core immediate family didn't have much money. They struggled financially, but his distant family, like his cousins and some other family members, were very rich. And I'm talking private jets, like that type of money. But Antonio and his core family had none of that money. And that caused a lot of turmoil at his home. Also, their parents like remarried a lot. One of them ended up remarrying like 8 times. Also, his biological mother died and some other stuff happened. So overall, Antonio's childhood was pretty rough and he suffered quite a lot emotionally. Which, here's the thing, like as a side note, he now believes that this childhood, even though it was rough, it was a good thing. Because as Neem Karoli Baba used to say, suffering and pain are the best vehicles to get to God and to get to the truth. So when he was a kid, because of this chaotic home environment, he turned a little bit rebellious, a little bit naughty, a little bit troublesome. And one day in school, when he was studying with the Jesuits in Caracas, Venezuela, he was causing more trouble than usual. And then one of the priests, one of the teachers, told him this. And I will play a clip of Antonio explaining the story.
Y el cura me dijo, Dañino, qué desastre usted, se la pasa jodiendo aquí. Váyase para la capilla a rezar 10 Ave Marías, 10 Padre Nuestros y 10 Glorias, una cosa así. A ver si Dios le calma. Entonces voy para la capilla, solito allá. Ya te sabrán, ya te sabrán. Tú sabes, una cosa totalmente automática en la cual yo no creía, como un niño de, ¿qué edad tendría? 9, 10 años. Y de repente vi a la Virgen y estaba viva, viva. La Virgen de yeso o de madera pintado, de lo que fuera, estaba viva. Sus ojos refulgían y su cara era viviente. Y me miró con muchísima compasión. Y yo me quedé asombrado. Y la miré, pero embelesado. Aquella belleza de madre. Y la Virgen me dijo, primero se sonrió y fue muy gentil, pero después se puso un poco triste. Y me dijo, ay, mi amor, vienen días muy duros para ti en el futuro. No pierdas nunca la fe. Yo voy a estar siempre contigo. Tienes que ser fuerte. Después sonrió de nuevo y se volvió a hacer la Virgen de madera. Cuando yo salí de ahí estaba sobrecogido. Yo nunca le dije eso a nadie. Nunca, ni a mi papá, ni a mi mamá, ni a nadie. Durante muchísimos años me lo guardé para mí y de verdad la vida se volvió muy difícil para mí. El divorcio de mis padres, me mandaron a Estados Unidos, un internado en Estados Unidos. Ahí se olvidaron de mí, no me escribieron ninguna carta, no me mandaron dinero. Estaba en un internado de gente rica sin un centavo, o sea, pero la Virgen me había dicho, se me olvidó lo más importante, que ella volvería a encontrarse conmigo cuando yo estuviese preparado. Eso fue su último mensaje antes de desaparecer.
And this last part, Antonio mentions when Mary told him that one day they would be reunited when he was ready. This is such a crucial part of Antonio's story, so don't forget it because soon you will see how it connects with everything that's about to happen. It's pretty cool. So now we're just gonna jump forward in time to the 60s. Here, Antonio, he was in his 20s, which by the way, I don't think I mentioned it before, but Antonio was born in 1940. So in the 60s, he moved to France to study art. Okay, Antonio is an artist. He was mainly focused on painting, and he was actually doing pretty well for himself. He was able to show his work in a few art galleries, and then he was mentioned in some newspapers and magazines, and that allowed him to sell most of his artwork and save up some money. Also in France, that's where he met his first wife, Nicole. And then in 1964, he heard that Jiddu Krishnamurti would be in Switzerland for a month giving talks. And Antonio, back then, it was during that time that he was starting to get more and more interested in spirituality. In fact, someone at his wedding already started telling him about all these gurus that you could meet in India and how incredible they were. So Antonio, during that time, he was slowly going down the rabbit hole of spirituality. So Antonio and Nicole, they decided to go to Switzerland so they could listen to Krishnamurti in person and also have like their honeymoon there because they just got married and Nicole was pregnant. So they went there and they spent a whole month listening to the talks from Krishnamurti. And here's the thing, slowly the idea of actually going to India and seeing it all for himself started to seep into Antonio's head. And after the month ended, after all these Krishnamurti talks were finished, Antonio decided to travel to India for 3 months and see it all for himself and go find some of these gurus that he kept hearing about. So he flew directly from Switzerland to India. He did not even go back to France. Nicole went back, but Antonio just flew to India straight away. And now begins the interesting part of the story. Now you will see how Antonio got his first guru, how he had his first mystical experiences, and basically how one thing led to the other, and he started to live this incredible life.
Uno de los padrinos de mi boda, hindú, me había hablado de varios maestros espirituales que yo pudiera contactar estando en India. Me había dado ciertos nombres. Entonces, cuando llegué, nadie sabía dónde estaba Anandamayi Ma y nadie sabía dónde estaba una señora llamada Rehana Tyabji. De tal manera de que yo estaba ahí sin vivir la India que yo quería. Entonces, tuve demasiada suerte porque un día me encuentro con este señor en la calle. Esa misma noche él me llegó a casa de una señora llamada Rehana Tyabji, la abuela Rehana. Ella había sido una discípula de Gandhi, era una princesa hindú de una familia de mucho dinero, una princesa musulmana, no era ni siquiera, y había abandonado tanto su fortuna como sus deberes de princesa para unirse al trabajo de liberación de la India con Gandhi y pasó desde muy jovencita hasta la muerte de Gandhi con él. Estuvo presa, etc. Y ella fue la gran introducción a la India para mí. El día que llegamos me impresionó muchísimo un inglés de Oxford, un inglés de una persona muy refinada, pero vivía muy humildemente, pero tenía algo real en ella. Y por primera vez en mi vida vi un aura, vi que alrededor de ella habían luces, colores hermosos. Y me quedé como asombrado, ¿no? Y bueno, y entonces llegó la hora de irse. Y cuando nos íbamos, ella me agarró por la mano y me dijo como en secreto, mañana vienes a las 3, pero ven solito, me dijo. A las 3 estaba yo allí. Y eso hizo una relación que duró hasta que ella murió. O sea, ahí nos enamoramos. Ella me escuchó con más paciencia y más amor que cualquier psicólogo. Ella me ayudó mucho. Y un día me dijo que ya su maestro le había dicho que ahora tenían que investigar mis vidas anteriores. Y entonces, una de esas tardes me mandó a pararme delante de su altar, que era un altarcito mínimo de este tamaño, donde tenía un pequeño Corán abierto, una foto del Señor Jesucristo, de Krishna y de Buda. Y entonces me dijo, bueno, tú párate ahí, reza como cualquier oración que te salga y nosotros hacemos el resto. Entonces empecé a respirar conscientemente, caí en un trance Y la primera vez que eso se hizo, vi películas rápidas de distintas vidas, de las cuales solo reconocí una en un monasterio medieval cantando cantos gregorianos. De resto eran en culturas que no podía yo saber exactamente dónde eran porque las películas eran rápidas. También decía mantras y hablaba cosas que no entendía lo que estaba hablando. Pero la madre, la abuela, luego decía que eran mantras hindúes, que eran de no sé dónde y de no sé qué. Eso no me impresionó mucho. Una cosa que les quiero decir, todo esto es sin ningún tipo de estímulo psicotrópico. La segunda vez que lo hicimos sí fue muy impresionante, porque esa segunda vez también empecé respirando conscientemente, también caí en el trance y vi que había una fuerza antigravitacional que subía por mis pies hacia la parte superior del cuerpo. Y como subía más por una pierna que por la otra, y eso hacía que casi me cayera, extendí los brazos y al extenderlos sentí que yo era un ave. Yo empecé como una danza que era como un vuelo de águila, pero en la tierra. Y eso hizo que esa antigravedad subiera y cuando llegó a la parte, ya pasó los genitales hacia arriba, se convirtió en luz. Entonces fue una subida de la Kundalini, pero no hecho con métodos hindúes, sino métodos del antiquísimo Egipto. Entonces subió hasta aquí y luego subió. Uy, esto todavía lo cuento y me conmueve mucho. Cuando ya mi conciencia era pura luz, Antonio Eduardo Dañino había desaparecido, llegó Horus, el dios halcón de los egipcios. Se paró junto a mí y me dijo, tienes que venir conmigo. Y arrancamos a volar y llegamos, después de volar mucho tiempo, a un cielo muy parecido al cielo que describe Dante en la Divina Comedia, que son círculos concéntricos de seres de luz que mientras más altos, más puros y luminosos son esos seres. Serían no solo ángeles, sino serían seres que murieron y están en ese estado de conciencia de post-mortem. Entonces subimos y subimos por esta inmensidad, esto es gigantesco, y llegamos a Dios. Entonces Dios no es un viejo con una barba, sino la luz de las luces. Entonces ahí nosotros, unas hormiguitas delante de esa inmensidad, y de repente de esa inmensidad salió un rayo y me tocó a mí, quizás en la frente, quizás en el corazón, no puedo decir. Y ese rayo era Jesucristo, pero yo estoy seguro de que si yo hubiese nacido budista hubiera sido el Buda. O sea, ese Dios era Dios, incluía todas las tradiciones. Entonces, eso sucedió y el halcón me miró como diciendo, bueno, eso era lo que teníamos que hacer. Y ¡bum! Nos volamos hacia abajo. Llegamos al cuartico de Rejana y yo estaba todavía bailandito con los brazos extendidos. El halcón siguió su camino y la Kundalini bajó hasta bajar por completo y caer yo en mi conciencia normal. La madre estaba muy impresionada, dijo que en toda su vida ella nunca había visto un ritual egipcio tan perfecto. Parece mentira, pero ella había viajado conmigo, me describió todo lo que yo había vivido sin yo contárselo. Ella tenía esa capacidad de paramatma, de ser uno con todo, ¿no? Una cosa que me dijo que yo había levitado en un momento dado, que me había alzado del piso, que yo no me había dado cuenta, porque yo estaba en otro estado. Ya yo estaba pensando que yo había hecho el viaje a India con el objetivo de encontrar un gurú y había encontrado mi gurú, que era la madre Rejana. Pero entonces un día yo llego a su casa, como siempre iba a las 3 de la tarde, me dice, ay niño, tú estás pensando que yo soy tu gurú. Yo no soy tu gurú. Yo no soy digna ni de tocar el borde del vestido de tu verdadero gurú. Yo solo te estoy preparando para ella. ¿Quién es? La madre Anandamayi. Entonces me mandó a Hardwar a ver a Ma. No la encontré. La busqué varios días en Hardwar, no la encontré. Volví a Delhi. En aquel momento, la ida a Hardwar tomaba 10 horas en un tren. Fui a Hardware, me quedé 3 días buscando, ¿no? Me devolví a Delhi. Fui a donde la madre Rejana me dijo, aquí no entras hasta que no veas a la madre Anandamayi. Volví a tomar el tren esa noche, me devolví a Hardware. Pregunté a cada persona de ropa de
Vale.
Sanyasi y finalmente di con ella. Entonces llegué después del mediodía y entonces me senté ahí. La gente se sintió muy curiosa de verme ahí, porque en ese momento ya los occidentales se habían ido con los ingleses y los hippies no habían llegado.
Hmm.
O sea que uno en la India no veía nunca un extranjero. Yo en 3 meses que estuve solo vi 2. Entonces pasa 1 hora, pasan 2 horas. Mano, sale. Era una habitación bastante grande. Yo estoy sentado opuesto a la plataforma donde ella se sentaba, con la espalda contra la pared, sentado en la alfombra, en el suelo. Y yo estoy sintiendo, este es el día más importante de mi vida. No porque Rejana me haya dicho ni nada, lo sentía yo en mí mismo. Yo sabía que ese era el día más importante de mi vida. Pero bueno, pero la madre no sale y pasan las horas y no sale. No, me dice la gente que la conoce, es que ella no tiene horario, ella sale cuando le dé la gana. Lo de ella es totalmente espontáneo todo. Mucha gente se levantó y se fue, pero yo no me levanté ni me fui porque yo sabía que ese era el día más
Claro.
importante de mi vida. Entonces, cuando Ma Anandamayi salió por una puerta y se sentó ahí, yo vi a la Virgen María.
Mm,
Yo no vi a Ma.
sí.
Maya era una señora de unos 70 años, pero yo vi a una muchacha
Ah.
impresionantemente hermosa y luminosa que se sentaba ahí. Me quedé. Entonces la gente se paró, tú sabes, a hacer el pranam. Y entonces alguien me dio un camburo, una manzana o algo para que le diera más. Y yo veía que la gente se decía, no, yo no voy a hacer eso porque la, el, la Declaración de Derechos Humanos de la Revolución Francesa, égalité, todos los hombres son iguales, uno no se hinca ante nadie. Y cuando me llegó el turno es que no me derretí. Era imposible no hincarse ahí delante de ella. Me derretí, o sea. Y entonces, bueno, me devolví a mi puesto y ahí sí vi que más ya no era una niña, sino que era una señora ya. Entonces me recordé que la madre Rejana me había dado un papelito. Entonces se lo di a alguien, que se lo dio a alguien, que se lo dio a alguien y le llegó a más. Entonces a uno de sus swami lo leyó en voz alta. Bla, 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 yo no entendí nada. Y más me picó el ojo y me llamó. Entonces, caminando hacia ella, cada paso que diera como 100.000 kilogramos de angustia que desaparecían. De tal manera de que cuando llegué a sus pies, estaba livianito. Entonces, bueno, me hicieron las preguntas de rigor, quién eres, cómo te llamas, de a dónde vienes, etcétera. Y finalmente la madre me dijo, oh, me miró a los ojos y me dijo a través de un intérprete, ¿qué hace un muchacho tan joven, tan lejos de su tierra, en un lugar tan lejano como India? Entonces yo respondí, I came looking for myself. Eso fue lo que respondí. Entonces ella me miró, de sus ojos salió luz. Esa luz me penetró y durante 12 horas no tuve ni un pensamiento. Viví en el presente perfecto. Y cerraba los ojos, ahí no estaba Antonio Eduardo con su historia personal. Lo que había era Satchit Anand, conciencia y beatitud y inteligencia, o sea, conciencia de tener conciencia. Y si abría los ojos, veía el mundo normal, pero no juzgaba. Me gusta, no me gusta, qué feo, qué bonito. No había ayer, mañana, era presente siempre. Y bueno, eso fue único en mi vida, nunca más se ha repetido lo conozco ese estado, pero corto, nunca perenne durante horas y horas y horas. Pero ese fue el verdadero principio de conocer qué es meditación, eso es meditación. Porque cuando yo vi el cielo estaba allá y yo estaba aquí. Aquí el cielo eres tú, en ese estado el cielo eres tú. No el cielo está allá y tú estás aquí, en ese estado tú eres el cielo, el reino de Dios está dentro de vos.
Exacto.
Bueno, ahí empezó la relación con Ma, yo la seguía a partir de ese momento, un mes más que me quedaba en la India, ella fue a Delhi, fue a Brindavan, ahí la vi, pero sabía que ahora a mí me tocaba pues trabajar duro para purificarme y lograr pues acercarme a ese estado y que ella me lo había regalado para que yo me diera cuenta de qué es capaz un ser humano, cualquier ser humano. Entonces, Ma, en ese primer viaje, Ma.
So that's the story of how Antonio got to India, met Rehana, if I'm pronouncing her name correctly, experienced some past life regressions, got his first guru, Anandamayi Ma, and experienced that 12-hour state of pure consciousness. But here's the thing, I hope that you caught that when Antonio described he first saw the face of Anandamayi Ma and realized that he was not seeing her face, but he was seeing the Virgin Mary's face. I hope you were able to connect that to what he shared earlier. You know, when he was 9 years old in Venezuela, when the statue of Mary came to life. When the statue of Mary came to life and told him that one day when he was ready, they would be reunited and they would be together for eternity. So that was the thing, that was the connection. The person, the soul, the spirit, the entity, whatever you want to call it, that was there manifesting through the statue of Mary was the same he encountered when meeting Anandamayi Ma. And Antonio told me he believes those two to be connected. And from then on, Anandamayi Ma would become Antonio's guru, and they would have lots of experiences together, they would travel and do lots of things. But before we get into those, I want to continue chronologically from where we are now, which is 1964, because not long after Antonio met with Anandamayi Ma for the first time, still within that 3-month period of his first trip to India, he had a couple really interesting experiences with Jiddu Krishnamurti. The first one, long story short, he was able to arrange a private meeting with Krishnamurti, like one-on-one. It was like a 20-30 minute meeting. And when he got there, when he got to that room with Krishnamurti, they just sat down, they looked at each other in silence and didn't say a single word for the entire meeting, like the entire 20-30 minutes. Krishnamurti said nothing, Antonio said nothing, they just looked at each other, they stared at each other's eyes for 30 minutes, and that's it. And Antonio told me that it felt as if Krishnamurti could see right through him, and could see all of Antonio's fears and worries and problems. So Antonio felt as if there was nothing to say and no questions to ask, because Krishnamurti could see it all. And after those 20-30 minutes passed, Krishnamurti just stood up and said, well, that's it, sir. We're done here. And here's the thing. Antonio really liked that experience. I assume for a lot of people watching this video, it might be difficult to understand what's the value behind it. But for him, it was very helpful. And there was a lot more going on there than just silence. So moving on, after these first 3 months in India, he went back to France for the birth of his first daughter, Maya. And then in 1965, he had yet another private experience with Jiddu Krishnamurti, now in Paris, but this time it was completely different and way more intense. Krishnamurti went to Paris to give some talks, and Antonio attended one that was exclusively for young people, which back then Antonio was 25 years old. And for this one, I have a recording, so I'm gonna let Antonio explain the story and you will be able to see his emotions and reactions.
Que él fue a París a dar conferencias en un sitio muy bello de París, que es la Sociedad Teosófica de París, que tienen un auditorio muy bonito, bastante grande, y eso se llenaba. Y como el segundo o tercer día, un muchacho me dijo, mira, Krishnamurti quiere entrevistarse con jóvenes, ¿tú quisieras ir? Entonces le dije, sí, por supuesto. Entonces llegué allí a una dirección X, en un apartamento X en París, y allí en el salón de ese piso estábamos no más de 8 o 10 muchachos, jóvenes todos, muchachos y muchachas. Y él habló y dijo lo que usualmente, si ustedes han leído a Krishnamurti, él siempre dice más o menos lo mismo, pero cada palabra me entraba a mí como un taladro, de tal manera que cuando terminó la entrevista, yo no me pude levantar de la silla, yo me quedé pegado a la silla porque me parecía que para llevar a cabo todo lo que él pedía como camino hacia la liberación, en ese momento parecía remotísimo para mí, imposible. Y entonces me quedé pegado en la silla. Él se paró junto a la puerta para despedir personalmente a cada uno de los muchachos que salía y yo no me pude levantar. Y él me esperó. Cuando haciendo un esfuerzo enorme me levanté, iba a salir y bueno, me dirigí a él, goodbye sir, thank you very much. Él me agarró las manos y me miró a los ojos. Y hubo un blank en mi conciencia. Y cuando volví a mí, estaba mirando por un ventanal del piso hacia le Champ de Mars en París, que es una explanada donde está la Tour Eiffel, y crepúsculo. Y en ese momento yo era la explanada, yo era el crepúsculo, yo era la Tour Eiffel, yo era todo lo que veía. Entonces, de algún modo eso entró no sé cuánto tiempo en mí, me calmó absolutamente y cuando salí del apartamento estaba en calma.
Antonio told me that this was the same experience and the same state of consciousness that was induced to him through Anandamayi Ma. You know, when Anandamayi Ma induced in him that 12-hour state of like pure consciousness and bliss. Now it was the same, but Krishnamurti did it, although it did not last for as long. It was way shorter. And even though Antonio would continue to meet with Krishnamurti in the future, I think this was the peak experience he ever had with him. Then, not that long after, he went back to Venezuela and he became an art professor in university from 1965 until 1970 or 71. And during those 5 or 6 years, he continued to live all sorts of experiences on his own. He became very close with a man named Don Rafael Dalmau, who was a Rosicrucian master, and he was a healer and a psychic. And on multiple instances, he was a healer and a psychic, and Antonio told me that on multiple instances, he saw firsthand how Don Rafael Dalmau cured some serious illnesses and diseases, and he also witnessed some of his psychic powers. And also during those years, Antonio also became very close friends with José Manuel Briceño Guerrero, one of the most influential philosophers of South America. And here's the thing, like Antonio also traveled all over South America, and he experimented a lot with psychedelics there. He visited ancient temples and sacred places, and just had lots and lots of incredible experiences there. I'm not gonna go into all of those, or this would become like a 10-hour documentary. The point of this video is just to share some of the highlights of Antonio's life, so you can get to know him and get a general idea of what he went through. And I hope that even though I'm leaving out a lot of details, you can read between the lines and see and understand like just how incredible Antonio's life has been. But anyways, then it was in 1970 or 71 that he got a scholarship to study a postgraduate degree in Benares, India. But he mostly used that opportunity just to spend time with Anandamayi Ma. So he went there and he spent 3 years traveling with Anandamayi Ma all over India. And that was his main focus, just to be with his guru. There's a couple experiences Antonio had with Anandamayi Ma that stood out to me and I liked and I want to share with you. But before I explain those, I want to explain the 5M Tantric ritual he did with the Agori in 1971. For those of you who don't know, the Agori are basically a group in India that follow very extreme taboo breaking practices to basically transcend worldly attachments. They meditate in cremation grounds, they cover themselves in human ash, they use human skulls for rituals. Sometimes they even eat meat from human corpses, and they do that to destroy their fear and duality because their core belief is that everything is divine, so nothing is impure in itself, and the way they believe you can come to that realization is through engaging with literally everything, even what most people would consider extreme or disgusting. And then they have this tantric practice called the Panchamakara, also known as the 5 M's, in which you have to engage or use the 5 M's, which are Madhya, usually wine, Mamsa, which is meat, which with the Agori, it can be human meat, and that was the case with Antonio. Then Matsya, fish, Mudra, gains, and Maituna, basically sex. So the way this came to be and how Antonio got to do the 5 M's, it's a very long story, but basically, a friend of Antonio from the US that was also there in India gifted Antonio some really pure LSD that had been prepared in the labs of Stanford University. So Antonio took LSD that night and a lot of things happened, but one of them was that he asked Shiva for a tantric initiation. And Antonio asked for that because he wanted to harmonize and stabilize his emotions, libido, love, and a few other things. And for those of you who've done psychedelics before, you know that when you're within that psychedelic state, your perceptions of things can be very attuned to things out of the ordinary. So when Antonio asked for that tantric initiation, he felt as if his petition had been accepted. And then the next day, again, a lot of things happened, but he was able to enter the Kashi Vishwanath temple, even though at least back then it was difficult to. I don't know about nowadays. And inside the temple, he met a man that took Antonio to Manikarnika Ghat, the famous Indian cremation grounds. And they went like inside a place that looked like handmade, like a small cave. And then there was this Agori who was covered as usual in human ashes. He had the classic Agori look, and basically they told Antonio that they were gonna help him get rid of his demons. So the Agori, which by the way some people there, they called him Paramahansa, which basically means like a realized master. So that Agori and also a yogini, which is like a female practitioner, the three of them got together and they were gonna do the 5M ritual. So the order of events was, first of all, to get rid of his clothes, and they just threw him away on a river, especially the clothes that he had attachment to, like shoes that he had been gifted and such. And then they left him naked and they gave him like a small rope to put around his waist with a small piece of cloth to cover his parts. And then for the next few days, they did like mantras and meditations. They slept on the floor. And eventually what they did on him was what they referred to as a study of consciousness, in which they help you see the weaknesses that are trapping you. So like basically those demons, those bad spirits that they were referring to earlier. I'm not going to explain what Antonio's demons were because that's personal, but they found Antonio's demons and weaknesses and all that. And once they got it, that's when they started the 5M ritual, because now they kind of knew like what were the demons that they had to target. So the ritual started on a black moon night, and the Agori cut off some meat from a human corpse and gave it to the yogini, who prepared like some curry with it, which also included some fish and grains. And then they put it on an altar that they had there to the goddess Chinamasta, which is this one right here. And then they started smoking, right? So I think instead of doing madia with wine, they did it with basically smoking. I think he told me they did weed. And then they waited until midnight. And at midnight, they started the tantric sex, which I'm not going to explain in detail what happened and exactly what they did, because again, that's kind of private. But what I can say is that at first Antonio, he was very nervous, but slowly he said that he started to feel how the sexual energy, as time went on, started to transmute into the awakening of the Kundalini until all of them reached Samadhi. And that state lasted until the next day. So Antonio did complete the 5Ms. Now, moving on and going back to what I was telling you before, I know we're covering a lot here, but there's a couple experiences he had with Anandamayi Ma during those 3 years that I liked. The first one is that you know that in India, there's a lot of religious festivities, right? And one day there was a religious festivity about Krishna, and Antonio went there with Anandamayi Ma. And while someone was giving a speech about Krishna, this happened.
En una fiesta de Krishna, donde un brahman así muy erudito está hablándole a una multitud de historias de la vida de Krishna. Yo estoy por allá por un rinconcito de ese sitio, sin entender demasiado lo que están diciendo, porque está en hindi o en bengali, pero con una idea vaga de lo que se dice, pero no en detalle. Como Ma está presente, porque ella no daba discurso, ella lo que hacía era sentarse ahí al lado. Como ella está presente, yo estoy muy eléctrico, y yo sé que se está hablando de Krishna. Y de repente miro hacia el jardín y veo que Krishna está jugando con las gopis en el jardín. La presencia de Ma atraía al propio Krishna. ¿Quién vio eso? ¿Lo vi yo solo? ¿O lo vieron otros? Yo no lo sé. Yo nunca le dije a nadie en ese momento, yo estoy viendo a Krishna ahí en el jardín, míralo. No, yo me maravillé con eso.
And then there's another story that Antonio told me that he considers to be very special because it's one of the first ones where Anandamayi Ma showed more proximity and closeness towards him.
Había alquilado un cuarto en una casa aledaña al ashram. Tenía varios días ahí, pasando el día completo en lo que se podía cerca de ella. Y una mañana, al levantarme y ya sentarme en la cama, llegó ella, su cuerpo astral, me dijo: vamos al monte Kailash, y me sacó de mi cuerpo y me llevó para allá, hacia ese punto central del hinduismo y del budismo tibetano, y la experiencia de muchísima felicidad, es lo que cuenta esto prácticamente. Y ese fue, de esa segunda etapa mía con ella de los 70, la primera vez que ella manifestó para mí esa cercanía.
Now, it was also during those 3 years that he got to meet Neem Karoli Baba. There was one time that Antonio was with Anandamayi Ma, and they were at an ashram she had in Vrindavan. And some of the devotees from Neem Karoli Baba came to the ashram. So Antonio was the one who showed them around, took care of them, welcomed them, and all that stuff. And afterwards, as a form of gratitude, they invited Antonio to Neem Karoli Baba's ashram in Vrindavan as well. So Antonio went there, they were serving food when he arrived, so they all ate, and after they finished eating, Neem Karoli Baba basically started to select people out of the crowd that was there to form like a small group and then go inside the ashram to talk in private. And Neem Karoli Baba chose Antonio among a few others. And here's the thing, like, then they went inside the ashram, but Antonio told me that at that point, he had such reverence and respect for Anandamayi Ma that he did not want to bow down to any other guru. So when they went inside the ashram, the first thing that everyone did was to first go to Neem Karoli Baba, bow down, touch his feet, like that's the tradition there in India. But Antonio did not want to do it, right? So he told me that he was trying to hide behind a pillar, I think. But then Neem Karoli Baba caught him, and instead of calling him by his name, he called him by Anandamayi Ma's name. So he was like, Anandamayi Ma, come here, right? But pointing at Antonio. So Antonio had to go there, bow down. And Antonio told me that the moment he bowed down, it might seem odd, but out of nowhere, he started to smell like this incredible perfume. And Antonio thinks that that's like some miracle that Neem Karoli Baba did at the moment. And that led him to start thinking like how silly he was being for trying to stay away from other gurus. And that Neem Karoli Baba was great too. And the fact that Anandamayi Ma is his main guru doesn't mean that he cannot spend time with other gurus and learn from them as well. Now, something that's worth noting is that Antonio also met lots of other gurus that are not as popular, like Swami Nityananda or Baba Muktananda, and also lots of anonymous sadhus and mahayogis. And Antonio told me that he saw many of them perform miracles, transformations, materializing things, even impossible physical feats like jumping across the Ganges River, a lot of stuff. But anyways, at one point, Anandamayi Ma told Antonio that he had to leave India and go back to Venezuela. Antonio did not want to do that, but he understood that he had to obey the guru. Something similar happened to Ram Das when Neem Karoli Baba told him that he also had to leave and go back to the US. But before leaving India, Antonio asked Anandamayi Ma if he could do a few more trips to see some parts of India that he hadn't seen yet and do like some sort of pilgrimage. So Anandamayi Ma agreed, and Antonio then started to visit many like temples and cities and sacred places. And one of the locations he went to was the Arunchala cave, where Ramana Maharshi used to live. Nowadays, if you were to go there around that area, you would come across tens of thousands of people, if not even more. But Antonio told me that when he was there, it was empty. Like maybe the whole way he just saw like 5 people. And I'm gonna let Antonio explain what happened.
Subí a una de las cuevas en la montaña. Esa es una montaña muy mágica. Dicen que la montaña entera es Shiva. Y ahí vivió muchos años, hizo toda su ascesis Ramana Maharshi como monje sin discípulos ni nada, totalmente entregado a su sadhana, y vivió en distintas cuevas que hay allí en la montaña. Luego poco a poco la gente fue subiendo para estar con él, hasta que le construyeron el ashram abajo, donde él vivió los últimos años de su vida ya rodeado de discípulos. Y en una de esas cuevas me senté a meditar y se aparecieron ahí en el darshan Ma y Ramana Maharshi, los espíritus de los dos, en una forma sutil, muy hermosa todavía. Me emociona pensar en eso. Flotando así en el aire, como... wow.
He doesn't explain it in this clip, but later I did ask Antonio like, okay, but what happened when they showed up? Did they say something? Did they do something? And Antonio told me that they didn't say anything, but he thinks that with their presence, they were trying to tell Antonio that both of them, Ramana Maharshi and Anandamayi Ma, were living in the primordial purity of the universe. Those are Antonio's words, in that which is beyond time, space, and form, and that they were blissful in that supreme unity. But that this state is possible for any human being that sets the divination of consciousness as a goal. Now, moving on, as Antonio was about to leave India, he had his first visions of Sathya Sai Baba, another well-known guru, especially around that time. And basically, Sai Baba told Antonio very firmly that he was to become his next guru. Antonio was a little bit hesitant and confused about it because Anandamayi Ma was still his main guru. So Antonio told me they even had like a heated discussion going back and forth about this. So then Antonio would go back to Venezuela in 1974, and he would not go back to India until 1999. Okay. Now, during that time, in 1975, Papaji visited Caracas in Venezuela for a month, and Antonio was with him every single day. And they got along really well because among the people in that area in Caracas, Antonio was one of the few, if not the only one, who also had lived in India for such a long time. And also Antonio speaks really good English because as a teenager he was in the US. So Antonio in a way became like Papaji's right-hand man and helped him translate and move around and all that stuff. Then in 1982, Anandamayi Ma died, and Antonio started to have more and more visions of Sathya Sai Baba. He had multiple of them, and Antonio told me that even in one of them, he physically touched him. So for those of you wondering if these type of appearances are just ethereal or also physical, That's what Antonio said. So eventually in 1999, he decided to go back to India so that he could go live with Sathya Sai Baba. And he was able to do that because India paid him to go teach some classes in the University of Bangalore and also do some research there. So Antonio brought his family there and they stayed with Sai Baba. That contract with the university only lasted 1 year. And after it finished, Antonio stayed 6 more years living with Sai Baba. So in total, 7 years. So from 1999 until 2006. Then Antonio would leave India, but would come back in 2011 when Sai Baba died. Which, when he came back to India, he told me he went to this main hall where Sathya Sai Baba used to give his speeches to thousands of people. But when Antonio saw that it was all empty, it really hit him that Sai Baba had died. And then Antonio dropped on the floor and he started crying. But then he says that he saw Sathya Sai Baba appear, but in a body of light, as in the painting of Christ of Grunwald. And basically Sai Baba told Antonio that he had no reason to cry because it was only his muscles and bones and his body that had died, but that his consciousness, he was as alive as always. And to this day, Antonio tells me that Sai Baba shows up from time to time to help him. Now, some of Antonio's daughters have followed his footsteps and they're living in India with their own gurus and their own families. Antonio right now lives in a small house in Venezuela. And he told me that one of the main things this whole spiritual journey has brought him is peace. A lot of inner peace. Because if you remember at the beginning of the video, I told you all the turmoil that he had during his childhood, which also carried on during his young adulthood. But it was through all of these experiences with all these gurus that he has been able to find a lot of peace. And look, something that I want to say to make it very, very, very clear. This video you just watched is a superficial and limited look into Antonio's life. There are so many incredible stories that I did not explain here. Out of the stories that I explained, there are so many details I skipped over. This video is just like 5% of what Antonio has lived. But if I were to explain it all, this would become like a 10-hour documentary. But something that Antonio has been working on for the last few years is writing a book that explains his entire life. All of his stories and adventures and experiences and lessons with a lot of detail. But here's the thing. Venezuela, where Antonio lives right now, is not doing great financially. And Antonio is honestly tight on resources. So something I decided to do to help Antonio is to set up a website where people can book calls with him. You can go right now to the link in the description, book a call with Antonio. He speaks perfect English and he can help you with anything, or you can talk about anything with him. If you're feeling spiritually lost or confused, or you're struggling with your attachments, or maybe you want to get his opinion on a mystical experience that you had that maybe you cannot figure out on your own and you want to understand what it meant, or you just have a general or technical question about something on spirituality, or maybe you just would like to talk more with Antonio in private and get to know him more and hear more of his stories. If you want to do any of that, if any of that sounds interesting, just click the link in the description and book a call with Antonio, and you will be able to learn from him and simultaneously help him financially so he can finish writing this book and share it with the whole world. I think if Antonio finishes writing this book, there is a good chance that it could become like a modern classic. Who knows, maybe like what happened with Ram Dass with the famous book of Be Here Now. Maybe it's not gonna happen right away, but I think eventually it's very likely that people could find it and it could become well known. And also think about this, like, if you could go back in time, wouldn't you love to talk with someone like Ram Dass? Someone who lived with a great guru like Neem Karoli Baba and had all of these incredible experiences and accumulated all of this wisdom. Well, right now you have someone of a similar or maybe even higher caliber available to you right now. So please, if you can, book a call with him. I would really appreciate it. It would mean the world both to me and him. There's a clip of Antonio I want to share with you of him explaining why he thinks it is so important for him to write this book and why it is his #1 mission.
Mi energía está en escribir estas cosas. Mi energía ahorita está en dar un testimonio de una vida rica para el hombre contemporáneo que está tan lejos de la espiritualidad, para decir, miren, se puede. Hay una dimensión en el ser humano que es espiritual y que hace mucho bien al alma si uno la toma. Yo sé que la mayoría de la gente es agnóstica, no cree en nada. En las grandes ciudades, un número enorme de gente va a los psiquiatras lo que le dan son pastillitas para mantenerlo más o menos sin que se maten, y eso pues como yo viví una vida tan distinta, me parece que mi misión es dar testimonio de esa vida y en eso es que funciona.
And one last thing, I did ask Antonio if he wanted to share like a closing statement for this video, and he sent me something he wrote in 2006 in Puttaparthi before going back to Venezuela. And it's this.
I've suggested to Bao Oliver to end this video that he's done about my experiences in India, reading a poem that synthesizes in a few lines the essentials of the teachings I received in India during the 10 years I lived there. In my youth with Anandamayi Ma, and in the last few years with Shri Sathya Sai Baba. So let's go and read it. The Sutra of Divine Identity, Sai Baba's challenge. Your life is your message. Words have no original value, for they come only after the experience, but are not the experience itself in its nakedness and glory. Their function is to communicate the experience, that is their strength and their worth. Go further inside, inside, inside. Go back to the primal, non-verbal root of all. Go after pure being. But first, dare to see yourself relentlessly, and to listen and to follow yourself relentlessly. There, every corner and every nook, every labyrinth of passion and desire, and the endless cacophony of the painting, unstoppable, whirling brain. Do not fear the sudden swells of lava lust, nor the icy venom of forlorn love. Find the space between two thoughts, two desires, two volitions, two fears, and cut through duality, for emptiness is beyond duality and obscuration. To know yourself entirely is to find God. To love entirely is to act like God. To be yourself entirely is to be God.
So again, please consider booking a call with Antonio. Check the link in the description. All the money goes directly to him. I don't get a cut or anything. So book a call and I'll see you in the next video. Take care. Peace.